Hello, this is Lauren Carr, and welcome to Authors on iTours, a podcast devoted to authors, book bloggers, and other book lovers alike. Hello, welcome back to Authors on iTours, and today we have a fascinating interview with Jame Lisa Forbes, the author of Sunny Gale, which is currently on tour with Ivory Book Tours. Jame Lisa Forbes was raised on a ranch in the Little Laramie Valley near Laramie, Wyoming. She attended the University of Colorado, where she obtained degrees in English and philosophy. After 14 months living in Israel, she returned to her family's ranch, where she lived for another 15 years. In 1994, Jame moved to Greensboro, North Carolina. In 2001, she graduated from the University of North Carolina School of Law and began her North Carolina law practice. Jame's first novel, Unbroken, won the WILLA Literary Award for Contemporary Fiction in 2011. Her collection of short stories, The Widow Smalls and Other Stories, won the High Plains Book Awards for Short Story Collection in 2015. Forbes' novel of rural North Carolina in the segregation era, entitled Eden, was published in 2020. Her historical novel about women bronc riders in the early days of the rodeo, entitled Sunny Gale, was published in May 2024 by Pronghorn Press. It is currently on tour with Ivory Book Tours. Jame continues to live and write in North Carolina. Do be sure to check out our tour page and also check out her. You can follow her on social media. The links are below in our interview details. Talking to Jame Lisa Forbes today about her new release, Sunny Gale, which is a historical fiction novel about the rodeo. And Jame, I think you'd be better to explain and tell us a little bit about your book and the period that it's taking place in.
Okay. So Sunny Gale is based on historical stories of women in early rodeo. Women were in professional rodeo from roughly the 1890s to the 1930s and competed in the men's events. So after researching that history, I combined a lot of the women's stories and fictionalized that history in order to bring that history to life. That was the purpose behind Sunny Gale. So Sunny Gale is the heroine, and she starts out as the daughter of failed pioneers in Nebraska. Her parents do not succeed as pioneers, and she falls in love with horses and just goes on. She starts a horse career basically and gets into rodeo and moves on from there.
Now, you said that this started as a history of that. That you were researching the history of that. Is she more based on any one character? One actual person?
That's true. So basically this history ran, like I said, from the 1890s to 1930, and there were successive generations of women in this. I actually kind of fell in love with one of the early ones, whose name was Prairie Rose Henderson. I kind of fell in love with her. And the readers can look her up online themselves, but if you look at the pictures of her, she was just so alive and so vibrant. And what was amazing about her was her costuming. She did all her own costuming, and her costumes were just really exceptional. Prairie Rose won a horse race. She won a relay race in Cheyenne at the very first Frontier Days. And then she came back a couple years later as a bronc rider. And this was what was fascinating to me, was that women at that period of time, when not exactly a progressive era, I think women were competing in the most dangerous of men's sports at the time. So she came back as a bronc rider.
Competing against men then.
There was, by that time they had women's bronc riding. By that
Okay.
time, women's bronc riding was a sport, and it was featured in not only in Cheyenne but at various rodeos. And so she competed, and she competed and won at Cheyenne Frontier Days. And then she went on to do. She joined a family in Cheyenne that was. They did a number of things. They did Western shows. They did rodeos. They did join that family, and also and then she just kind of wandered around. She had two children in the interim, and most of the rodeo women were either not married or had husbands for very short periods of time. They weren't able to hold on to families. So I figured that was the same for her, and I did end up confirming that. So, but she did have two children, and then she just kind of wandered the West and competed here, there, and everywhere. She won one more Cheyenne Frontier Days during her career, and somehow she ended up on a ranch in central Wyoming. That was her last husband that she ended up with a ranch on she ended up with that husband in central Wyoming. And then he was arrested for cattle rustling. He was arrested and jailed for cattle rustling, and she was not able to survive on that ranch. She disappeared during a blizzard, and her body wasn't found till years later. And then she was buried in Cheyenne.
Ah. Now, what got you interested in this topic for these novels and for doing the research?
I'm from Laramie. Wyoming. Of course, that's rodeo country. I grew up on a ranch, and I'm very, very familiar with Cheyenne Frontier Days. I've been to dozens of Cheyenne Frontier Days, and all the time I was growing up, all of the 40 years I lived in Wyoming, I never heard of this history. It's not memorialized. It's not talked about. It's no way mentioned in any place. And so when I first came across the pictures of Prairie Rose Henderson in her split skirt riding a bronc at Cheyenne Frontier Days, I thought, whoa, what the heck is this?
And why has nobody heard of her before?
Why has nobody heard about this? I mean, bronc riding, I mean, that's an extremely dangerous sport. And it has killed many of a person, and women were doing it at that time. So I was just like, where is this coming from? Why didn't I hear about it? Why isn't this known? And so that's when I started digging, and I learned that at a time when women still couldn't vote, they were out competing as bronc riders at these rodeos and making careers for themselves doing so. And that was just that just blew me out of the water. When gender is still an issue, we still 100 years on, we're still talking about what the barriers of gender are. And I mean, I think women showed back then there are no gender barriers. Women can do what they want to do. And I was just very taken by that history, and taken that it had been swept under the rug.
Mm-hmm. Now, what challenges did you run into in writing? Because now I don't write historical fiction, so because how do you bring it to life and keep it authentic? Writing nowadays, and reviewers have been complimenting you and praising how well you write, and how you were able to take the readers to that time period and that world. I mean, that would be a different world than what most of us would know about.
Yeah.
Bring it to life.
Well, just starting when I think of the novel chronologically. When I grew up on a ranch, I was coming up in the 1960s. So I just tried, as far as the landscape, I tried to imagine everything gone. All the built infrastructure gone, all the fences gone, everything gone. which wasn't too far of a stretch. So those early chapters in the book that talk about the Nebraska sandhills, it was easy for me to picture that all the infrastructure, everything being gone, so that I could get that going pretty well. As far as my heroine, she starts out as
Sunny
Hannah
Gale.
and becomes
Sunny
Sunny Gale.
Gale in your
Yeah.
novel. Yeah.
As far as her learning to ride, I myself ride, and I love to ride. So the idea of a girl getting breaking from her parents and falling in love with horses and wanting to ride, that wasn't a stretch for me either. Where it got to be a stretch was bronc riding itself, because I I I absolutely can't imagine bronc riding. And I thought, well, how do you even begin to do this sport? How do you get your head into doing this sport? I had never thought. I mean, I've seen hundreds of bronc riders, and I've never stopped to think, okay, well, how do you get your head there that you're going to do that? And so basically, with that part of this book, I just got on YouTube videos and watched bronc riders talk about what they do and turned it all into slow motion to try to figure out what they're doing and I listened to them talk about why they do it, so I could sort of think about how my character would evolve doing that. So that was a big challenge there. And then I decided to have a Native American secondary character. And so I had to go back and research the history of the Wind River Reservation in Wyoming to figure out how she would have evolved. Because there were a lot of Native American cowboys and cowgirls at that time.
What was the relationship like back then between the ranchers and the Native Americans in that area? We're talking like the 1890s.
Well, there's kind of two questions there, really, because there was the reservation life, which is kind of in western central Wyoming, and then there was Cheyenne Frontier Days. Native Americans were always very welcome at Frontier Days, because Frontier Days was actually started as an exhibition to give Denver people something to do on the summer. So, Cheyenne wasn't very much developed, but Denver was. And Cheyenne Frontier Days was a way to get Denver people up to Cheyenne and spend money and get interested in Cheyenne. And that was good for the Denver people because they had somewhere to go. So there were trains running from Denver to Cheyenne to get this going. So, of course, if you're going to put on some kind of Western show, you want to have Native Americans. So Native Americans were very involved in Cheyenne Frontier Days from day one, even though there was discrimination. For example, there were the white events, and then there were the Native American events. So as far as rodeo, Native Americans were always involved from the get-go, at least in Cheyenne. And I noticed that was true of Pendleton, Oregon, too. But as far as the reservation versus the surrounding ranches, that's a very complicated history. And basically, it's a history where whites, at least in my opinion, just basically encroached on the Native Americans' land and took the best land.
What challenges did you specifically run into as far as your research? Because you said that you had a hard time finding out about women in the rodeos back then.
It's not so much that there's a very good summary history called Cowgirl Up by Heidi Thomas. I started there. That's a very good summary history. The challenge was, and there's a lot of good interviews. You can find good interviews of these women before they died. What was hard about it was trying to pick up the subtext of their lives, why they got into this, how did they get into it, how did they walk into an arena and say, yeah, I'm going to ride broncs here? How did they do that? How did they convince men that would be an event? And then the biggest challenge was, what were their family lives like? Because the subtext I could read in the research was their family lives were very strained.
Yeah, you mentioned that your main character, or rather the woman that you based it on, like her marriage didn't last.
I think she ended up with 5 different marriages,
Uh-huh.
because I mean, if you're traveling, if your heart is set on a career, and this is again, we're talking at about a time when women couldn't vote, and when
Yeah.
the thought of a career for women was just way out there,
Mhm.
then what who's going to tolerate you being gone so many months of the year?
Yeah, and could they how what's the span of the period that you had that your book covers? You
I
said
actually I did it exactly the way the history I understood from 1898 to roughly 1932.
oh, okay. So basically you're covering her entire life.
I did, yeah, I covered her entire life, and again, that was so I could get to I could cover the other women in rodeo and the transitions of time, of how they evolved over time, what they did. For
Mhm.
instance, my heroine and a lot of the other heroines go into trick riding. Um, And then I could also cover why this all came to an end.
Now, why did you decide to novelize it instead of writing a nonfiction uh, history book? What drove?
The reason for that was the nonfiction I was reading just didn't bring the women to life. It just
Uh-huh.
didn't make them live. And I just thought their lives must have been so fascinating. They must have been, I would have loved to have met one of these women.
Yeah.
Yeah, they must have been so vibrant, and as I've described Prairie Rose, and I just that was missing in what I was reading, and I wanted them to come back to life, and
Mhm.
I feel like I've done that because I've get so much reader feedback to that point. But that's what I wanted. I wanted these women to live again, since this history had been so marginalized.
Mhm.
So I just wanted to bring them back to life.
Uh-huh. So now you're on tour.
Yes.
You're on tour with Irie Book Tours. Can you know, and you've been getting great feedback. You mentioned the feedback. So do you think this is going to change anything as far as women in rodeo? Well, women are still in rodeos because rodeos are
Yeah.
still
So what
going on.
happened was, I'll fill out the history. So what happened was, um, there was there were 2 women who were killed in
Uh-huh.
bronc riding in 1932. Both were killed in
In the
accidents in
same
rodeo.
competition, in the same or
They were killed at different competitions.
uh-huh.
And I mean, that's not unusual for rodeo. I myself
Yeah,
have
it is
seen people
rough.
killed in rodeo. That's not unusual, but I think there was a there was there was a backlash from that.
Yeah.
And gradually, women disappeared from all the Western rodeos. Madison Square Garden continued to have women in rodeo for a while, but eventually that ended, and all of a sudden, women were gone from rodeo. That was it. They weren't allowed to compete in rodeo anymore. And
Oh, okay,
then
I did not know that.
the
Okay.
1940s came along, and by that time, we had, all the media representations of the West in the movies. So when the 1940s came along, that's when women came back into the rodeo arenas as queens.
Uh-huh.
My
Oh,
aunts were both rodeo. My father's sisters were both rodeo queens, and that was the beginning of the rodeo queen movement. And then finally, in the late 1940s, they started letting women in doing barrel racing, which is the barrel racing that exists today. But as far as competing in the real dangerous men's events, that has just now started back. Just now, I was told, both this last year and this year, they are allowing women's bronc riding again at Cheyenne Frontier Days.
and that concludes this episode of Authors on iTours. If you enjoyed this episode, then do give us a like and a thumbs up, and be sure to subscribe so that you can receive notifications for upcoming episodes of Authors on iTours. In the meantime, happy reading!